Today we are going to be talking about plant reproduction. Alright, so there are two different ways that organisms reproduce, and plants are able to do both. As humans, you'll see in this picture down here, we're only able to reproduce sexually. Some organisms only reproduce asexually, and some of them can do both. So we're going to take a look at the differences between sexual and asexual reproduction. So the first way, sexual reproduction, two organisms combine their genetic material to make offspring. We typically think of this as sperm and egg. The female, or the person who is donating the egg, is giving the 23 chromosomes in the egg. Person who is donating the sperm is giving 23 chromosomes in the sperm, and then they combine for 46. And that's just for a human. Other organisms have different chromosome numbers. So you see, we've got sperm and egg. These represent sperm and egg combining and then producing offspring. And you'll notice the offspring they can produce end up being slightly different. We know that when adults have kids, all their offspring are not the same. We also have asexual reproduction, and this is when one organism copies itself. It makes an exact copy, and it makes something that has the exact same DNA. So think of it as a clone. A lot of times organisms do this by splitting themselves in half. So bacteria is a good example. They literally just copy their entire DNA sequence or RNA sequence, divide in half, and then each of the halves have the same exact DNA sequence. So again, plants are interesting because they can do both. There's other organisms out there that can do both as well. So we're going to first talk about asexual reproduction. How do plants make clones of themselves? So there's a couple different ways. And the whole idea here is that we are making a clone or an exact copy. So one of them is called tip and stem layering. This is just when the stem comes into contact with the ground and develops roots. So some bushes, like raspberry bushes, as they're growing, the stem kind of bends over, and then part of it starts developing roots. Tomato plants can do this. If some of the branches are on the ground, the branches will start developing roots. And so it's just the stem comes into contact, develops roots, and then sometimes we see like, oh, it looks like a different type of a different plant here, but it's really just part of the same plant. We have something called a rhizome. A rhizome is when the stem grows underground. So it shoots off a separate stem here, and it's underground, and then it pops up a different place. Grass does this. If you try to pull grass, it's connected. All the little tufts of grass in your yard are connected underground with these little stems. Some other plants here, they can grow underground and sprout new plants as well. And then we have cuttings, where stem or leaves are placed in water and then start to develop roots. So here I've got a video showing us some development. I'm going to change the playback speed here. This is some basil, and what they did is they just cut off some basil, put it in some water. Eventually, over time, it ends up developing roots, as you can see. And so then you could plant this plant. So cutting, they literally cut part of a plant and it starts developing roots. So these are ways that plants reproduce asexually. Either they've got a stem or a root that is going above ground or below ground, they shoot up another plant, or part of the plant gets cut off and then makes new roots. Now let's talk about sexual reproduction. How do we combine genetic material from two different plants? So one way is self-pollination. So it's pollinating itself. So a plant pollinates its own flowers with pollen. So you can see letter A here. It's showing the pollen from its own plant landing on what we'll learn is the stigma, but landing on the same plant. Okay, pollen from its own plant, from its own flower, landing on the same. B is also an example of this because it's still part of the same plant. It's separate flowers, but all of the DNA in this plant is still the same. So same plant, it's just fertilizing or pollinating two different flowers. Then we have cross-pollination. And this is pollen from one flower pollinates another flower on a different plant. And so theoretically, this should probably say pollen from one plant pollinates another plant. But we got one plant, its pollen, it's got its own DNA. And its pollen's gonna go onto this plant, which has different DNA. So this is cross-pollination. We're going to be talking mostly about cross-pollination in this unit. So let's talk about pollination. So pollination, in order to talk about pollination, we got to talk about the parts of the flower. So I have a diagram that we're going to be using in a minute, and if you're absent, just ask me for the diagram the next day. But the first thing we're going to talk about are the parts that we can kind of see really easily on the outside. So the first thing are sepals. Sepals are green structures that protect the bud before opening. Let's watch some of these flowers bloom. We know that these are petals. See these little green guys? I'll show you again here. The green guys here are the sepals. And sometimes it depends on the flower. Green guys, right? They surround the entire bud before it opens. So the green ones are the sepals. You can see them on the bottom here. And the whole goal here is just to protect the flower before it blooms, because the petals are pretty delicate. Green, right? Sepals. So the petals are actually there to protect the inside parts where the reproductive parts are of the flower. And then they're also pretty colors to attract pollinators. So you can see all the green, those are all sepals. The green, the sepals. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to move on to our diagram. So on our diagram, if you have a note packet, it's already in there. If you're doing this in your notebook, I will get you a diagram. The petals are the outside here. These are going to be our colorful ones. And then the sepals are down below. They're green. And before this turns into a flower, they're protecting the bud. All right, more flower parts. So we're going to talk about the male and female flower parts. Now I understand that we say male and we say female, right? And we know that in humans, right, sex can kind of be part of this whole big spectrum. But scientists still refer to parts of a flower as male and female, all right? So we are going to use those words. So the male structure is called the stamen. So the male structure is this whole thing right here, and it's made of different parts. So there's different parts to this. So the first part's the anther. The anther is on the top. What the anther does is it makes pollen. So pollen is the sperm of flower. So if you're allergic to pollen, you're actually allergic to plant sperm. So those are the cells that are going to fertilize the egg inside of the plant. So anther makes pollen. We have the filament. Filament just is the long stalk that holds the anther up. The only other time you might have heard the word filament, a light bulb has a filament. It's the little wire that's inside a light bulb. So you can think of this as being kind of like a long skinny wire in a light bulb. And then pollen. Pollen's our plant sperm. We don't have it on here because it's just little tiny dots in the anther. These are the male structures. So now we're going to move on to the female structures. So the entire female structure here, this middle part, is called the pistil. So we have an ovary. Similar to humans, you might have heard ovary in humans. So the ovary is going to produce the eggs. Now, if those eggs are fertilized, the ovary becomes a fruit. So if you're eating an apple, you're really eating an ovary. If you're eating an orange, you're eating a plant ovary. So the ovary is going to become the fruit. Inside the ovary, we have eggs, and the eggs we call ovules. Ovules, eggs, if they get fertilized, they turn into seeds. So if we think about this apple we're eating, the outside's the ovary, right, the part that you eat, and then inside are seeds, and those are the ovules. And then at the very top here, we have a sticky surface. So we have to get the pollen, which is the plant sperm, to the egg down here. We'll talk about how that happens, but we have to attract the pollen here. And so the stigma is the top part here, and it's typically sticky. And that's so that pollen, if it's blowing in the wind or stuck to a bee, gets stuck here, and then the pollen can make its way down to fertilize the egg. So we have these labeled. The last thing here is the style. And the style is just the name for like the little stalk structure. We had the filament, right? The little stalk that held up the anther. This is just the style. So we have different types of flowers. We have flowers that are perfect. And we don't mean like, oh, they're picture perfect. We mean they have both male and female parts on the same flower. This lily is an example. We see the female part here, the pistil, and then we see the stamens on the outside. Some flowers, though, only have male or only have female parts. And this would be an imperfect flower. So this flower here only has the female part, the pistil, and this flower here only has the stamen. Now, it doesn't mean they only ever have one. Like, say, for example, I have raspberry plants in my yard. Some of those plants are going to have only the pistils. Some of those plants are only going to have the anthers, but they're able to cross-pollinate, right? So flower Y could give pollen to flower X, and then we could produce raspberry fruit. So one example of this are pumpkin or squash flowers. True story, last year I was growing cucumbers, which belong to the pumpkin and squash family, so their flowers look a lot like this. And I was like, gosh, I kept getting all of these flowers on my plants, but I wasn't getting any fruit. So I did a little research, and I found out that if they aren't getting enough nutrients, a lot of times they produce more male flowers and they're not producing female flowers. So I didn't have any female flowers, so even though my male flowers on that plant were producing pollen, they had nothing to fertilize. So I added some more nutrients, and sure enough, I got some female ones, and then I ended up getting cucumbers. So let's talk about fertilization. All right. So the first thing, how do we get an egg to a sperm or a sperm to an egg? This is what we're talking about, fertilizing. So pollen has to be released from the anther, and then it sticks to the stigma. This is called pollination. It's just when pollen moves from one plant to another, or one flower to another. After that, there's a whole series of events that happens, okay? So if we take a look at this picture, we've got a little pollen grain. This is the female structure. We've got the egg down here. And these are all multiple eggs. What happens is the pollen has to get to the eggs. So it grows something called a pollen tube. It makes a little tunnel for it to go into the egg. And then it's able to combine its genetic material with the egg and become fertilized. And remember, we said the ovary here is going to become the fruit. The eggs, the ovules, will become the seeds. All right, so second step. Pollen tube grows down the style to deliver the sperm to the ovary. Fun fact, if you eat corn on the cob, you know all those little stringy corn silk pieces? Those are all pollen tubes. So those were all to deliver the pollen to the kernels so that the kernels of corn could be produced and that you could eat them. So after the sperm's delivered to the ovary, right, they get fertilized and the ovary develops to a fruit. Fertilization just means our egg and sperm are combining. But if there's no fertilization, the flower dies and falls off. So fertilization turns into a fruit. No fertilization, the flower just dies. This is kind of a fun time lapse here. We have flowers. So they're blooming. Okay, they're going to get pollinated and then fertilized. And then we can watch them turn into apples. This is what they look like. Right? And then the apples continue to grow and grow and grow. And so, you know that little spot at the bottom of your apple where there's kind of like that crunchy stuff? That's really where the flower was. So we are going to stop there. If you have any questions, don't forget to get any diagrams from me that you missed, and have a good day.